Great stuff. Well, bonjour tout le monde. Good morning, everyone. My name is Linda Barber, and I'm the branch manager here at the Ottawa branch of the National Association of Federal Retirees. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which the Ottawa branch is located is traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. On behalf of the Ottawa branch, I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Beach Day or Deadly Heat Wave, What You Need to Know to Beat the Heat Safely. We welcome our presenters, starting with Dr. Glen Kenny. Dr. Kenny is a full professor of physiology at the University of Ottawa, and he leads the Human and Environmental Physiology Research Unit, the largest facility in the world, dedicated to assessing the human response to heat stress. And he's joined today by Dr. Robert Mead, a senior postdoctoral fellow, and Emma McCourt, a graduate student. And I can't tell you how proud we are to be working with Dr. Kenny and his research team at University of Ottawa. And we know many of our members, hundreds in fact, have eagerly signed up to participate in Dr. Kenny's research studies to help seniors, and we hope many more of you will do so too. Veuillez noter que le webinaire sera présenté en anglais aujourd'hui, mais la participation bilingue est toujours encouragée. Now, I want to give a special welcome to anyone here who is not yet a member of the association. We really hope that these webinars will encourage and inspire you to join us. And I also want to welcome our own members and the members of Outaouais branch who are joining us today. Nous sommes ravis d'offrir ce webinaire aux membres de nos deux sections. There will be a question and answer period at the end of the webinar, and all you have to do is type into the chat box the questions that you'd like to have answered, and our presenters will answer them after the session is over. So now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Dr. Kenny. Merci beaucoup.
Excellent. Hopefully everybody sees the slide presentation with the title that we have today, Beach Day or Deadly Heat Wave, What Do We Need to Know to Beat the Heat Safely? So first of all, good morning, everyone. And I certainly would like to thank the National Association of Federal Retirees for this opportunity to present to you today. It's certainly an honor to be here along with my senior research associate, Dr. Robert Mead, and my graduate trainee, Emma McCourt, who will be presenting along with me today. So it's a real great pleasure to have them here. We have a lot of excellent information to share with you today. Many of you and your colleagues at the National Association of Federal Retirees have contributed to this important research and that we'll be presenting today, and we thank you for your very important contribution to this work. I hope that you'll find today's presentation to be helpful to you and your colleagues, and that information you will gain will help you understand what steps you can take to protect yourself, your neighbors, your loved ones during extreme heat events. So thank you very much for your time. Now, let me make sure I can get this going right on. Here we go. So I'm sure that as many of you are aware, we're facing unprecedented times with rising temperatures as we continue today to see record-breaking temperatures such as what we're seeing in the Asian countries today. In Western Canada, Canadians are also facing the heat early into spring. And I think many of you have already heard about the oops, I think I've moved the pictures over. So about that. Many in Western Canada face an unprecedented heat wave in 2021. As you remember, during that period, 619 older adults lost their lives during this brief 2-week heat event. This event showed Canadians they are also at risk, and that it's not just people living in hotter climates who are vulnerable to these extreme heat events. Canadians are particularly vulnerable because we are less heat adapted, especially early in the season. We spend many months locked in our homes, as you know, over the winter, long, cold winter days, protecting ourselves from those cold, windy days. However, when the first hot day comes, we want to rush out to the beach and enjoy the hot day. So this brings into question whether we as Canadians are really prepared for these hot days. As I indicated, 619 Canadians lost their lives during the brief 2-week heat event. But we can't forget what we saw in 2003 in Europe, where there were 70,000 people that lost their lives during a prolonged heat event. So the question remains, are we adequately protected? Are we prepared Do we have the right knowledge to help Canadians take the appropriate actions to protect themselves? As you can see on the slide, there are different strategies. So to that end, in partnership with Health Canada and with the excellent support of the members of the National Association of Federal Retirees, we have made great progress to address these questions and define heat mitigation solutions to protect all Canadians. So in today's presentation, we are going to look at some of the recommended heat mitigations that you see on this slide and determine if it is going to be adequate to help you beat the heat safely. Despite all that you hear from the media and public health officials about steps to stay cool on hot summer days, surprisingly, I guess some of you may or may not know that we still have limited information about the effectiveness of different cooling strategies, such as what you see on the slide here: use of fans, use of cooling center, limb immersion, and other approaches. Our work has been directed at evaluating this guidance so that you and your loved ones may be protected during hot weather. Now, many of us live in Ottawa or the surrounding regions, and obviously we may think of ourselves as immune from the effects of heat stress. It is important to understand that there are many factors that can affect your risk of heat-related injury. As we get older, we lose the ability to dissipate heat. The presence of chronic disease, poor fitness, medication use can worsen this response. But there are other factors, as you see from the slide over here, such as the built environment that can affect your risk. The type of home you live in, its location within the city, the amount of green space surrounding your area, whether you have a golf course or whether you're packed in like sardines in the highly dense areas of downtown, and other factors will affect how hot your home gets in a hot summer day. Now, just to remind you that during the 2021 heat event in BC and Western Canada, some homes without air conditioning attained indoor temperatures well above 40 degrees Celsius. That's certainly going to be hotter than anybody would experience if they're migrating south during the winter to go to Florida or some of the Cayman Islands and other areas. So on that note, another critical goal of our work has been to define a safe indoor upper temperature limit. And this is where Rob will take the lead and review this work with you. And then he will be followed by Emma, who will then review some of the other heat mitigation strategies. I'll pass it on to Rob at this stage.
Thanks so much, Glenn. And thank you everyone for coming. So as Glenn mentioned, most heat-related deaths and hospitalizations actually originate from within the home. So a big question we're always thinking about is, well, how cool do I need to keep my home? If we get air conditioning, this isn't really an issue. Glenn, you're on your email.
Oh, sorry about that.
Thanks. So this isn't really an issue if we have air conditioning, but sometimes we don't. Sometimes the air conditioning is maybe not as powerful as we would like, and sometimes we just don't want to, spend the money keeping our house very cool. So we've been doing a lot of work and accumulating a lot of evidence on what temperature is kind of the maximum we should allow our home to get. And there's emerging evidence to show that this is probably in the range of around 26 degrees, at least for Canadians. So you can go to the next slide, Glenn. And we're not the only ones actually kind of making these recommendations. In fact, just very recently, the Chief Medical Officer of Canada, Dr. Theresa Tam, released a very interesting report titled Mobilizing Public Health Action on Climate Change in Canada, where she too kind of advocates for this upper 26-degree temperature limit as probably sufficient to protect most people from overheating in the summer. And in fact, she even goes on to say that some municipalities like Metro Vancouver have actually already begun to mandate that this 26-degree temperature limit is sufficient for indoor environments. So for all multi-unit residential buildings in Vancouver built after 2025, they will need to include cooling strategies, air conditioning, to ensure that indoor temperature will not exceed 26 degrees Celsius in the summer. So, a lot of kind of push behind this 26-degree upper limit. So the question is rather, where does this 26 degrees come from? And it actually comes from a few sources. The kind of main line of evidence used to support this limit is epidemiological. So we know that in Canada and particularly in Ontario, when air temperature increases around above 26 degrees Celsius, we start to see an increase in adverse outcomes like deaths, as well as emergency service calls. So we can see this in the figure here on the right-hand slide, and I'll kind of break it down for you. So what this figure is showing is the relative risk of heat-related, or I guess death in Ontario, in Toronto in particular, as a function of the outdoor ambient temperature. And you can see at the top there that this is ambient temperature measured at the Toronto City Airport, as well as the Pearson Airport. So if you look, what you kind of see is the risk increases as air temperature increases. And then when air temperature passes around 26 degrees, which is shown in the blue line, we see the curve start to pull away from that 1.0 line. So this is where we would say that at air temperatures above 26 degrees Celsius, we have a statistically significant increase in the risk of mortality. So this is kind of where most people draw the evidence for this 26-degree upper limit. But if you remember a couple slides ago to what Dr. Kenny was saying, there's a bit of a problem here. And the issue is that this air temperature is measured outdoors. But depending on, housing design, whether or not you have access to air conditioning, where you live, 26-degree temperature outdoors at the airport maybe isn't the same temperature as you might be experiencing in your home. And in particular, especially in Canada, we actually see that in some instances, indoor temperature can actually be higher than outdoor temperature because our houses are built basically to keep heat inside in the winter. Unfortunately, that puts us at a bit of a disadvantage in the summer. So for this reason, in our lab, we've kind of been looking at this from a little bit of a different perspective. And what we've been interested in the past 3 years, 4 years in determining is, how does this indoor temperature limit affect the actual physiology of a person? So to do this, we performed the largest of its kind, actually, laboratory-based study evaluating simulated indoor overheating in the laboratory. So what essentially we did was we invited individuals aged 65 to 85 to come into the laboratory, and they came in on four different occasions, and we exposed them to simulated overheating in one of our fancy climate chambers. So four different trials, 4 different visits to the laboratory, a range of different temperatures. So the lowest temperature we exposed them to was 22 degrees Celsius. And we can think of this as kind of like a control condition. This is the same air temperature as air conditioning. The next highest temperature was 26 degrees Celsius, which I'm sure you were expecting because that is our upper limit that we're interested in testing. And then we also exposed them on different occasions to 31 degrees Celsius, which is consistent with a hot day in Ontario, and then 36 degrees Celsius, which is really kind of the highest temperature we've seen in Ottawa, at least when the study was designed. This is changing very rapidly, but this was consistent with the 2018 heat wave in Ottawa around Canada Day. So they came into the laboratory. We put them in the chamber for 8 hours. They could read, they could watch TV, and we monitored their body temperature and cardiovascular responses over the course of that exposure. And by looking at the figure here that Glenn is thankfully highlighting for me, what you can basically see is in the hottest 2 conditions, so the 36-degree condition in the red and the 31-degree condition in the yellow, we see this kind of rise in core temperature from the start of exposure, and this kind of stabilizes at around 4 to 6 hours after they enter the chamber. But at the end of the day, core temperature is elevated almost an entire degree Celsius from the 22-degree air conditioning control condition, which is in the blue. So this is quite a big increase in thermal strain. And this was actually associated with very stark reductions in blood pressure. And in the hottest condition, when we performed kind of simulated activities of daily living, so an example is we had people lying on a bed and they would have to stand up. We actually saw that some people weren't able to maintain a standing posture because they were just that hot, their blood pressure was just that low. Now, by contrast, if we look at the 26-degree condition, which is in the purple, we see that the difference in core temperature is actually not very large. And in fact, this didn't meet the kind of threshold, a 0.3 degree difference that we would, for the time being at least, consider what might put someone at risk. So we saw that the core temperature was maintained within kind of a safe limit in the 26-degree condition. And in line with this, we really saw no differences in cardiovascular responses between that 22-degree condition and that 26-degree condition, indicating that these are likely sufficient to, at least for a single day of exposure, protect us from adverse physiological strain. Go to the next slide. So based on this, actually, the British Columbia Centers for Disease Control has put together this very simple infographic based on our work. And what this infographic just kind of says, it just marks the air temperatures into kind of 3 rough categories. So below 26 degrees Celsius, a single day exposure is likely not going to cause undue physiological strain in older adults. However, in the range of temperatures around 26 to 31, these are not ideal temperatures to have our home. For some vulnerable occupants, they might be dangerous. For other healthy individuals, you wouldn't want to basically be exposed to these conditions over prolonged periods. If you can all avoid it, you want to keep air temperature below 26 degrees Celsius. And then above 31 degrees Celsius, where we really need to start to worry. This is the air temperatures where we're going to see a lot of physiological strain. We're going to see large reductions in blood pressure. So over these conditions is really when we need to start thinking about other strategies to help keep us cool. So what happens if you can't keep your house cool? You don't have air conditioning, your air conditioner not powerful enough, you don't want to, you want to use your air conditioning all the time. Well, the next best strategy is actually just going and finding another air conditioned environment. So we have this, you hear all the time about emergency cooling centers propping up, but this could be really any air conditioning environment, including air conditioning shopping mall. You could go see a movie you've been meaning to see, or you could just visit a loved one's house that has air conditioning, and hopefully you'll get a meal out of it as well. So if you go to the next slide, Glenn, we know actually, epidemiologically speaking, that visiting a cooling center is very protective. So individuals who have visited cooled locations during heat waves, it's been shown that their risk of dying during a heat wave is reduced by up to 66%. So this is quite a stark reduction and these are individuals, compared to individuals without going to a cooling center and without air conditioning as well. One of the things, without getting into it too far, that we've kind of asked ourselves in the laboratory is, does this actually have to do with the cooling, or is this due to another factor? So for example, if I have to go to a cooling center and I don't have a car, maybe I have to call a relative to take me there, or maybe I have to take public transit. And when you leave your house, there's more of a chance, you might bump into someone who notices you're not acting the same, you look kind of hot, and then maybe you seek medical attention because they've mentioned it. So one thing we wanted to do in the lab is really determine, does this short exposure, visiting a cooling center for 1 to 3 hours, does this actually reduce body temperature to an extent that we would think might be actually beneficial to helping people stay safe? So what you're seeing on this slide is the results from another study we did in the laboratory. Very similar to the one on indoor temperatures we showed a couple slides ago, where we brought individuals into the laboratory aged, in this case, 60 to 80, and we exposed them for 9 hours to a simulated heat wave. And in this case, it was 40 degrees Celsius and 10% relative humidity, so quite hot and dry. We split the individuals into 2 different groups. So the control group, which we have here in the orange, basically was just exposed to the heat wave for the entire 9 hours. So they rested in the heat in the seated position for a full 9 hours at 40 degrees. Then in the cooling group, which is in that kind of blue purple color, what we did instead was we exposed them to the heat, same exact conditions as the control group. But for hours 5 and 6, we actually removed them from the heat. So they exited our thermal chamber and they just rested in an air conditioning environment for 2 hours. And during this time, we measured their core temperature and cardiovascular responses, much like we did in the previous study. So what we saw in this case, as you can see in the figure here, is that in both groups, core temperatures increase almost identically over the first 4 hours of heat exposure. Then when we remove the cooling group from the heat, we see this very rapid reduction in core temperature. And actually, after 2 hours of exposure to the cooling center, their core temperature was reduced almost an entire degree compared to the control group. So this is quite a very powerful reduction in core temperature. So in line with the idea, you go to a cool environment and you'll be cooler. So, maybe not surprising, and certainly some reviewers didn't think it was overly surprising. But where this study kind of shines is that we were also able to look at the kind of increase in heat or increase in body temperature after we return to the heat. And what you can see there is that once the individual returns to the hot environment, there is a rapid increase in the body's internal temperature. In fact, by the 8th hour of exposure, the core temperature responses in each group were statistically equivalent. So there was no difference in core temperature, even though the group had been exposed for a whole 2 hours to a cool environment. So this is actually quite novel information, and it basically tells us that while a cooling center is very powerful, it's not going to necessarily provide the the most protection once we return to the heat. So this is okay if we go to a cooling center in the hottest hours of the day and then it cools down and we can go home and maybe our homes cool down overnight or into the evening. But if our homes remain hot into the nighttime or into the evening, we need to start considering that maybe a cooling center doesn't provide the most protection in those cases. So it's still very powerful, but there are caveats. Okay, so air conditioning, very cost prohibitive. Some people don't have it. And then going to visit a cooling center, sometimes not just feasible to leave your home. Maybe you don't have a way to get there, or maybe there's reasons that you can't leave the home. So we've also been interested in evaluating commonly recommended low cost and what we call sustainable cooling interventions that we can use in our home. And there's quite a few, and we're going to go through those right now. But the kind of gist is that for the most part, these strategies are going to be really good for improving our thermal comfort. But when it gets to the hottest conditions, the evidence is kind of out on whether or not these are going to be effective. So what do I mean by low-cost cooling strategies? Well, the first thing that most people think of, you go to the next slide, is electric fans. So electric fans are very popular. Certainly I use one when it's not too hot. And it helps. Basically, the way an electric fan works is very different from air conditioning. What essentially happens is when you use a fan, you increase the flow of dry air across the skin surface. And if that air is cooler than your skin temperature, you're kind of removing the warm layer of air temperature or air that builds up on your skin. And this helps facilitate heat loss to the environment. Now, this same mechanism means that as air temperature increases and the gradient or the difference between air and skin temperature is narrowed, fans become less effective. And then in fact, in hot environments where ambient temperature exceeds skin temperature, so at around 34 to 35 degrees Celsius, what ends up happening is you actually have fans will cause more heat gain by the body. It works exactly the same as a convection oven. By continuing to push hot air over a person or a turkey, you can actually help, or it will heat up that object, that person quicker. But recently, there's been some groups that have kind of questioned this, because what also happens with a person that doesn't happen with a turkey is that as you increase the flow of dry air over the skin, you're also helping to evaporate sweat. And sweat is the most powerful cooling mechanism in humans. So we kind of question, there's all this kind of back and forth about whether or not fans are effective. So we performed recently a very extensive modeling study to evaluate, what is the potential for fans as a cooling strategy? And we show the results of this modeling or simulation study here, and it's a lot of information, so I'm going to very slowly walk you through it. So what we have basically, or what we did, is we just, rather than testing individuals in the laboratory, we kind of just simulated two individuals, a young adult, age 18 to 40 years, on the top panels, and then an older adult, age 65 plus years, knowing how, as we get older, our ability to lose heat and regulate core temperature starts to become a little bit impaired. It declines. So then we modeled basically what are the responses, or what would be the expected increase in core temperature for these individuals resting with and without a fan. So the very left-hand column, and we'll focus on the bottom panels for the older adult, we see the increase in core temperature that will be expected to occur during rest in a range of ambient conditions. So that's on the vertical axis, and differences in relative humidities. So let's make this a little bit easier as well. We'll focus on a specific condition. We'll use that same heat wave condition in our indoor temperature study. So around 36 degrees Celsius and 40 to 50% relative humidity. So our modeling basically predicted that an individual resting in this environment would experience approximately a 1 to about 1.1 degree increase in core temperature. So quite a large increase, and we definitely wouldn't want to sustain this over prolonged periods. Now, the next panel in the center essentially shows how much core temperature would be expected to be changed if we had used a fan instead. The first panel, there was no fan, and now we're using a fan. And what we can see in these conditions is that with a fan, core temperature would be expected to be reduced approximately 0.1 to 0.2 degrees Celsius, so a couple tenths of a degree. Now, this might not seem like a large amount, and it's actually not very big. We would expect, like I mentioned a couple slides ago, if we were going to recommend any cooling strategy, we would want to see probably at least a 0.3 reduction in core temperature. So to just look at this a little differently, in the right-hand side here, we've also plotted the effectiveness versus air conditioning. So this is essentially what the reduction in core temperature with a fan, how would that stack up against if we had just remained in a cool environment? So we didn't even enter the heat to begin with. In this case, we see that when air temperature exceeds that kind of 35 degree limit up into 36, fans are only about maybe at most 20% as effective as air conditioning. So again, we really don't want to necessarily rely on fans as a standalone cooling intervention, particularly when we get into these kind of very extreme heat wave conditions. Now, as I mentioned, this is simulation data, so it really doesn't tell us yes or no. It gives us an idea of what kind of changes in core temperature we can expect. So to follow this up, we actually went into the laboratory and said, okay, what does the laboratory data align with what we've seen in this modeling study? So this is a recent study we actually just completed, I think like a month ago. The data is we're still analyzing it, so this is preliminary data. But essentially what we did, similar to the other studies I showed, is we brought individuals into a laboratory, age 65 to 85, and exposed them for 8 hours on 3 different occasions to a simulated heat wave in Ontario. Again, it's this 36 degrees Celsius, 45% relative humidity conditions. On one time to the laboratory, they basically rested without a fan, no cooling, and every 2 hours we actually in this case got them to stand up and they would perform some simulated activities of daily living. So we're really trying to get at, what are the activities, what are the exposures that we can experience indoors at home during heat waves. So that no fan condition is in the yellow. Then on the other 2 occasions, we brought them in and we used an electric fan to push air over the front of their body, and you can kind of see how that looks in the picture on the right hand side of the slide. Now on one occasion, the fan speed we set to 2 meters a second. So this is consistent with the airflow generated by just a regular kind of pedestal or small kind of desktop fan. This is what a normal fan would do. And then to really see if fans, how they affected core temperature, we also used a condition where we had a 4 meter per second airflow. So this is not attainable by most fans you'd buy on the market, but if you wanted to go on Amazon and really shell out on the top of the line fan model, you could probably get this level of airflow. So you can see the core temperature responses. If I didn't put the colors there, it would be very hard to distinguish between the conditions. So we basically saw that core temperature increased, like in the other studies, over the 8-hour exposure. But there really wasn't too much of a difference between the different fan conditions. In fact, if you look on the panels on the right-hand side here, we actually saw that the responses in the fans, the 2 fan conditions, were statistically equivalent both for core temperature and heart rate compared to no cooling at all. So again, really highlighting that when it gets to these hot conditions, fans, even though they might improve your thermal comfort, they're not going to necessarily protect you from undue physiological strain. But this isn't the end of the story for fans. So Glenn, you want to switch to the next slide? So there are ways we can potentially use a fan to kind of bolster its cooling effectiveness. And one way that's often talked about is using a spray bottle or a sponge to kind of add a layer of water to the skin while we're using the fan. So the idea here is, a couple slides ago, I mentioned that fans can be effective for actually facilitating sweat evaporation. But as we get older, we don't sweat as much. So what if we added kind of a simulated sweat, just water to the skin, and see how that affected the effectiveness of fans? So we've done this in a modeling study. We basically extended our model to consider a condition where water was being sprayed on the skin, and we see some kind of promising responses here. So if we look at that again, 36 degrees Celsius, 45% relative humidity, we see that if we add water to the skin, we actually could get about a 0.4 to 0.3 degree reduction in core temperature with fan use. This wasn't still quite as effective as air conditioning, but we're getting in the range of about 1/3 to about half the effectiveness of air conditioning, maybe actually a little bit less than that in those conditions. But the idea here is that this modeling kind of points towards the idea that, if we can access air conditioning, but we have a fan, we can kind of exploit the thermal properties of water to help cool us. Though I will add the very important caveat that we have not yet evaluated this strategy in the laboratory. So this is pointing towards a strategy, but we're not able to actually say whether or not this is going to be effective. But with that, I'm going to pass it over to Emma, and she's going to handle a couple other strategies, also water-based ones.
All right, thank you, Rob. So Rob's gone over kind of fan-based studies, but water-based cooling strategies have also been suggested for combating. In most cases, health agencies would suggest trying cold showers, cold baths to try to cool down. But the idea behind that being that water helps remove extra heat from the body and makes the cooling process a lot easier and faster than would be with the full kind of exposure to dry air. Another reason for promoting these water-based cooling strategies would also be that they can be used during power outages to try to mitigate the effects of extreme heat. Now, we know that taking a full dip in water is considered the fastest and most efficient way to cool off. But let's face it, it's not always the most convenient or accessible method for everybody. And so alternatively, health agencies have suggested just doing leg cooling, assuming that it provides kind of similar benefits to that whole body dip. Unfortunately, there's very little empirical evidence to back that up, particularly research targeted towards heat vulnerable older adults. And so to address this gap, what our laboratory did is that we conducted a study on leg and neck cooling to see how it affected physiological heat strain. So once again, just like the fan study, what we did is that we recruited individuals aged 65 to 85 years. They came into the laboratory on 3 separate occasions and experienced a 6-hour simulated heat wave in conditions of about 30 degrees Celsius, 35% relative humidity. The only thing that changed throughout these 3 experimental sessions was that we changed the cooling intervention that was applied. So of course we had a control condition with no cooling, that's shown in yellow in the graphs here. And then we also had 2 cooling interventions. So one where they had their legs in a bucket of water at about 20 degrees Celsius, and another where they again had their legs in a bucket of water at 20 degrees Celsius, but they also had an additional cold and wet towel around them. And so in the top panel here, we have the core temperature response during the heat exposure. You can again see that it goes up during the heat exposure throughout the 6-hour period. But what we can also see is that all the data for the 3 conditions are quite similar. So we didn't really see any difference between the cooling and control conditions in terms of core temperature changes throughout the exposure. However, if we look at the heart rate responses on the bottom panel, what we can see here is that there's a very light decrease in heart rate in the cooling condition. So this was a decrease of about 5 beats per minute. And although we did find this reduction in heart rate, it's hard to say how this translates to a real world scenario and how this may be effective in the real world and whether this is clinically significant. So it's something to consider for the future. And so overall, Rob's discussed kind of the fans and I've discussed the limb immersion. But what the research shows is that if there is any effect of these home-based personal cooling strategies, it's quite small. And really, when it gets quite hot outside, the best thing is to find a cold location to try to beat the heat. Okay. And so with all these kind of home-based cooling strategies that we've gone over, realistically, you're not going to be cooped up in your home throughout the entire day. You might have errands to run, people to see, kind of activity to do outside. And so what we've done here is provide some important tips when you're trying to stay active outside in the heat. And so first and foremost, the most important tips would be to limit your activities to cooler times of the day. So this would mean going on walks in the morning or evening versus at midday when the heat is at its peak. And then you would also want to try to avoid direct sunlight, putting on a hat, staying in the shade, all little steps that can try to make sure you stay safe. The next 2 steps have to do with maintaining your general well-being. So you want to make sure you're feeling at your best when you're going out of the heat. You want to make sure you're getting enough sleep, fueling your body properly with proper nutrition, good water intake. And finally, you want to make sure that you're not overexerting yourself. So you want to listen to your body, take extra breaks, even though you may feel like you may not necessarily need them. And finally, you also want to buddy up. So find somebody to either share the load on a task if you're gardening, lift heavy things outside in the sun, and also just have somebody there to keep an eye on you and you can keep an eye on them to, again, mitigate that risk of succumbing to heat-related illnesses. So throughout all this, whether you're indoors or outdoors, one of the most important things is also to be able to recognize the signs of heat-related illnesses. So what we've done is that we've collaborated with the BC CDC to create an informative pamphlet, which you can find on their website or on ours. And this pamphlet just basically goes over some of the common heat-related illness symptoms. So it can range from severe symptoms like difficulty speaking, unusual coordination problems, to light symptoms like irritability, fatigue, thirst. So just something to keep at the forefront of your mind whenever you're experiencing any heat stress. Next slide, Glenn. Perfect. Another thing that this pamphlet goes over is some of the basic emergency responses to, again, keep in mind whenever you're experiencing any heat stress. So in the worst case scenarios, of course, you would call 911. But whenever somebody's experiencing mild to moderate heat-related illnesses, you would try to relocate the individual to a cooler room, try to remove excess clothing, provide some low-level fanning, all little steps that can really make a difference in managing that response. And next slide, perfect. And the last thing that this pamphlet goes over is the importance of checking in on people. So just because you may have air conditioning in your home doesn't mean that your neighbor or your loved ones or your family members may have the same protection. And so being able to check in on them throughout prolonged periods of heat waves can really make a difference. So we advocate through this in-person health check-in, just going over, see how they're faring, and also having the necessary equipment in case anything goes awry. So having spray bottles, cold water bottles, ice packs, towels for soaking in cold water, and just being prepared for any kind of heat-related emergency. And while this in-person check is ideal, realistically, remote check-ins can also make a big difference. And so this would involve basically just calling somebody up, again, see how they're doing, either over the phone or FaceTime, and having any necessary type of information in case you do need to call 911. So this would be their address, their age, their general health that can help facilitate the process and get them help in case of emergency. And so with that, I'll pass the talk over to Dr. Kenny, who'll finish off the presentation.
Awesome. The heat is on. As Emma indicated, obviously there's a lot of risk out there, folks. And the one thing I think I need to remind you of is that heat is a silent killer. And of all the thousands of people that I've assessed over the 30 years plus in the field or in the lab, it's very difficult to detect. So the best thing to do is always listen to your body. So thank you, Robert and Emma, for your presentation thus far. I want to finish off, as the current image shows, you essentially can take action and certainly be part of the solution. As our presentation showed, there are many ways to keep yourself cool. There are also steps that you can take to protect yourself within your home and reduce the negative health impacts of indoor overheating. You can take action to find ways in which to keep your home cool inside in advance of those hot summer beach days that I know you're waiting for, certainly the cottage goers. While many of us may not wish to have what you see as in here, an air conditioner, there are alternative ways in which you can reduce the burden of hot weather on indoor temperature. And this can include, for example, covering your windows with solar blocking window coverings. You can use awnings over your windows. You can also plant trees around your home and shrubs, and that can provide not only shade, but keep the immediate area cool. Just remember that your home can be a safe haven so long as it's protected from the external environment. Be prepared for the next extreme heat event, and if possible, create a temporary safe summer living space in a cooler area of your home, equipped with your basic needs. So you would isolate that room from other areas, especially if you don't have central air conditioning. It's an effective way to, again, protect yourself in an extreme heat event. Remember what I said at the very start, during the BC heat event, indoor temperatures reached far in excess of 40 degrees Celsius. So while today we reviewed a number of studies that we have conducted with the support of you and of Health Canada, there's still a lot to be done. And this heavily populated slide certainly shows us that. So you can see the areas that are circled in red. Those are the many areas that we touched on in terms of looking at single day exposure, looked at the effects of age, sex, and chronic disease, and how that can affect your well-being while exposed to indoor overheating. But there's certainly a lot that we don't know. We don't know the effects of consecutive days of heat. Remember, heat waves are not typically just a single day. They can be multiple days, as we saw in the Western Heat Dome and certainly in the European Heat Dome of 2003. So to address these other remaining questions, we are forging ahead with our work, including, as you see at the bottom of my figure over here, looking at heat mitigation strategies, both for workers and looking at it as well on other heat mitigation strategies as we see commonly used in homes, and that is the use of ceiling fans. I think we need to remember there are many vulnerable Canadians who are bedridden, such as those in long-term care, and I'm sure maybe you have family member in long-term care, and those residing in retirement homes that live alone and do not have air conditioning. So if we think about it, ceiling fans represent probably the most viable option yet. But we know, as today's presentation indicated, that maybe it may not work under all conditions and provide the level of protection that one needs. So we need to understand the effectiveness of ceiling fans as well, although we know it's commonly used in some long-term care facilities. Finally, we also need to understand the effects of extreme heat stress on workers. And that's probably one of the areas that we know, despite all the work we've done, we still know so little. During the extreme heat event of 2021, we saw utility workers, first responders, construction workers that were doing emergency work facing deadly heat, and they were not given the appropriate tools to protect themselves. So there's a lot of work to be done, and certainly we're only at the tip of the iceberg when it comes to providing that level of guidance that we need to protect all Canadians. So in closing, I would like to finish off by, first of all, thanking you for taking the time to participate in our presentation. But I would also like to welcome you to our laboratory to participate in other studies with our partners at Health Canada. In addition to assessing other heat mitigation strategies, such as the use of ceiling fans, we'll be looking at how menopause affects the health and well-being of women who are exposed to extreme heat events. So you see this on the slide over here. We are also looking at the effects of exercise. Remember what Emma said, that the studies that we have done thus far, with the exception of the fan, was primarily done in resting individuals. However, we need to remember that people are going to be physically active during hot days as they complete perhaps chores around the home, walk to their doctor's appointment, shop for groceries, and others. We need to understand the added burden of physical activity on the body's stress response during a heat exposure, so that we can find the appropriate protective guidance possible, most effective protective guidance possible. And for this study, we are looking for older adults, adults between the ages of 65 and 80 with and without chronic health conditions. And finally, as I indicated earlier, that one group that we're also starting to assess, remember, we have an aging workforce. And despite what everybody thinks, that we workers are well protected, all of the guidance that's out there for workers is primarily based off of data in young men. So those older workers, and we have a lot of workers that are well above 65 that are going to be exposed to these harsh conditions. So we're developing, I should say, safe work limits for older workers, workers between the ages of 50 and 69 is who we're looking for, individuals between the ages of 60 and 69, men and women who would be interested in participating in our study that we're starting now. So if you like to exercise, you love a bit of the heat, come out and talk to us, and we'd love to have you engaged in our study. Finally, I thank you very much for your attention, and certainly we are ready to answer any of your questions.
Hi, Glenn. Antoine here. We do have right now one or two questions in the chat, so I can read them out. So this person is asking, I live in an apartment and I simply turn on the fan on my thermostat without hitting the AC button. I feel the cooler air flowing, but no change in the temp reading on the thermostat, which still reads 25 degrees. Is that okay?
Do you want
to go ahead, Rob?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's definitely good. That's a good strategy. Glenn, can you actually go back to the modeling slide? So in our assessments of fans, we're really kind of most interested in whether or not fans are going to be effective as a standalone cooling intervention for when it gets really hot outside. So as I mentioned, when air temperature is lower than skin temperature, fans are pretty effective for helping to remove heat, and that's certainly why you feel a cooling effect when you have the fan on. But even though you don't see a change in the thermometer. So if you look at this slide where Glenn is showing, we really were only considering conditions over 30 degrees Celsius. So these are not as common in Canada, certainly becoming more common. So when in a normal situation, if you find the fan makes you cooler, this is going to be a good strategy. It's when it gets very hot, like up into the 30s, high 30s, even the low 30s, but above 30 degrees Celsius, that we really need to consider whether or not this is an effective cooling strategy.
Perfect, thank you. So our next question, a bit more logistical. Can you please provide a link to the pamphlet? So I think we should be able to, Glenn, if you want to share the link with me, I'll be able to share it with everyone in the follow-up email.
Yeah, and Antoine as well. We will share with your members a pamphlet that we've created, a checklist. In addition to monitoring your health and safety, a checklist to help you prepare for a heat event. That means preparing your home for a heat event. And I do want to remind everybody that at the end of the day, you may feel safe in your home, but always remember, you may have loved ones, as somebody indicated, they live in a high rise, no air conditioning. You may be in a home where essentially you're in townhomes, they're compressed together, there's no green space. That temperature outdoors can be 5 to 6 degrees hotter than maybe you. If you're living perhaps in the outskirts of Ottawa with a lot of space between homes, it could be cooler. So we'll give you that that checklist as well, Antoine, so you can post that up.
That's great. I think, yeah, we'll send that over to everyone here and everyone who registered. So there'll be an email after the presentation with those pamphlets. So our next question here, were there people who originated from hot countries part of in the study? They're wondering if the heat affects some people differently and using that in the study.
You want to go ahead, Robert? Do you want me to answer? I can answer.
Yeah, no. So we didn't, when we designed the studies, we didn't put any controls on, where people were necessarily born. As far as I understand it, and Glenn can correct me here if I'm off base, but there's really very little effect of where you're kind of born or where you're originated on thermoregulatory function. What's more important is kind of your recent history. So, did you just come back from a hot location? Did you weather or winter in Florida, for example? So to kind of account for this in the study design, we changed it for each different study. So that indoor temperature study that I showed, we specifically recruited participants in the summer because we figured, okay, so these are indoor temperatures for the summer. So we should specifically recruit participants that have been exposed to summer temperatures. And we do know, at least in some of the data we've collected, there is probably some small effect of acclimatization on responses. However, when it gets really hot out, there are limits to human adaptation. And so for the average person who's maybe exercising outside, but still, generally living in a cool environment, is probably not going to provide too much protection, though the jury is still out on this. It's one of the things that we have on Glenn's large slide with all the different future study ideas. And then I will also add that for the other studies, the cooling, like the cooling center study, and then the simple exposure studies, we performed those in the winter. And the rationale for that was we know that the first heat wave of the year is often the most deadly, first period of hot temperatures. And as Glenn mentioned at the start of the presentation, this is likely because we've just spent all winter in Canada and it's very cold. So in that case, we didn't consider it, but we took kind of the worst case scenario, someone who was fully unacclimated to heat, to assess the efficacy of those cooling interventions.
All right. Well, thank you for answering that. I think that was a good answer. I think we have one final question, unless more come in. And this person is asking if you would have strategies or tips specifically for hot and humid conditions. Let's say they're visiting a country, maybe an Asian country that has more humid conditions than they're used to.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And a number of years ago, we essentially assessed older adults exposed to hot, dry, hot, humid conditions. And obviously, I think one of the points that we were saying at the start is as we age, unfortunately, we lose our capacity to dissipate heat. So that includes our ability to sweat. And obviously, as you're exposed to a humid condition, while you may be sweating, that sweat will just drip off your skin and provide no cooling. So part of the adaptation there might be, again, to get a bit of heat exposure before you go. So there's level of adaptation, but just remember when you do that, you probably will sweat a bit more. So what's most important in that situation is minimize the exposure to the humid conditions, try to stay in a cooler area. But more importantly, I think, is in this situation, realize that for the same type of exposure, meaning that for the same amount of time exposed, you're going to store more heat. So just pace yourself, remain well hydrated in this situation, because your body is likely to sweat more, or at least try, so that it can prevent that higher increase in core temperature.
Another question came in. So if you have low blood pressure, does it mean you are more at risk with heat?
I'm assuming you're talking about if you had a medical condition with low blood pressure, if you're hypotensive consistently. If you have low blood pressure, I think one of the outcomes that Rob indicated or showed, or we did not show it in today's presentation, but one of the side effects of day-long heat exposure is the burden that's placed on the cardiovascular system. Your heart has to work that much harder. But in doing so as well, remember that when you are exposed to heat, all that skin vasculature that you have in your body, the 100 miles of skin vasculature, that skin vasculature has to dilate, has to open up to try and, again, protect your body and try to dissipate or at least prevent heat gain from the environment. So in doing so, if you already have difficulty, as we saw, Rob was indicating that towards the end of a day-long heat exposure, your ability to regulate blood pressure is compromised. So the risks are that you might experience heat-induced syncope, so a rapid drop in blood pressure that might cause you to faint. So be aware of that. So when you're doing simple tasks in the heat at home, let's just think about it, going from sitting to standing. You're sitting in your chair, suddenly you get up, or you're going from bed rest to upright standing. All those maneuvers require really blood pressure regulation. And if you already have a low blood pressure, that may cause you to suddenly experience dizziness and potentially fall.
All right, I think that's it for the questions. Thanks, Glenn.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Antoine, and thank you so much to Dr. Kenny and his team at the University of Ottawa, and Dr. Robert Mead and Ms. Emma McCourt. We're so grateful to have access to this information and to see how hard you're working to look after seniors. And I'm sure we've all got something useful, a takeaway, especially you talked about that first heat wave of the season being the really deadly one. So again, we're super grateful. This is actually webinar number 5, Dr. Kenny, that you've done for us, and we're thrilled. We hope there's many more. And we hope that our members too will sign up, as they have done in the past, for your research studies. We're definitely going to share lots of information in the follow-up email that Antoine's going to send out to everyone. And it'll also contain instructions on how to access the video so that you can share this presentation with others. I want to remind our members that you can always invite guests to participate in our webinars. And our thinking is that if they find the webinars interesting, maybe they'll decide to join us too. And if you want to register for upcoming webinars, just go onto the Ottawa branch website, and the address for that will be in the follow-up email as well. And other than that, I just want to thank everybody again, and particularly Dr. Kenny and Dr. Mead and Emma. And we hope you all have a wonderful, safe, warm, but not too warm summer season coming up. Merci beaucoup et au revoir.
Thank you.